A hospital room in Houston, Texas, March 1987. The fluorescent lights hum overhead. The monitors beep in that slow mechanical rhythm that tells you a man is still alive but not for much longer. Santo Trafficante Jr. is 72 years old. He has just come through heart surgery, and everyone in the room knows it did not go well. His lawyer of 25 years, Frank Regano, is standing at the bedside. The old man's voice is barely above a whisper. His eyes are half closed, and then he switches into Sicilian dialect, the language of secrets, the language you use when you want only the right ears to hear. The words, as Regano would later recount them, land like a grenade with a 30-year fuse. Carlos messed up. We should not have killed Giovanni. We should have killed Bobby. Giovanni. The Italian form of John. Regano stands there, frozen, trying to process what he has just heard. The old man's eyes close. Within hours, Santo Trafficante Jr., the most powerful mafia boss most Americans have never heard of, will be dead, and those words will hang in the air for the rest of American history. For more than 3 decades, this one man operated at the intersection of the American Mafia, the Central Intelligence Agency, the international heroin trade, and what may be the most consequential political assassination of the 20th century. He was arrested multiple times. He was investigated by the FBI, the Senate, and 2 congressional committees. He was never convicted of anything. He never spent a single day in prison for a major felony. He died in a hospital bed of natural causes at 72. In a world where nearly every one of his contemporaries was shot, dismembered, deported, or disappeared, Santo Trafficante Jr. simply got away with it. But here is the question that has haunted investigators for decades. Was Trafficante actually involved in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy? His own lawyer says he confessed. A Cuban exile businessman told the FBI 2 years before Dallas that Trafficante said Kennedy was going to be hit. The House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded the president was probably killed as part of a conspiracy and named Trafficante as one of the likely figures involved. Yet Trafficante swore under oath he had nothing to do with it. Someone is lying. The question is who and why. And there is a second mystery, one perhaps even stranger. In 1960, the Central Intelligence Agency recruited Santo Trafficante Jr. to assassinate Fidel Castro. They handed him poison pills. They gave him operational support. The mission failed. Every attempt failed. Some historians believe the failure was deliberate, that Trafficante was never trying to kill Castro at all. That he was, in fact, a double agent, feeding information to Castro's intelligence service to protect his own skin. If that is true, it means the most powerful intelligence agency on Earth was being played by a man who looked by every account like a retired accountant. Those 2 mysteries, the Kennedy connection and the CIA betrayal, sit at the center of one of the most extraordinary criminal lives in American history. A life that starts not in some smoky back room in New York or Chicago, but in a place you wouldn't expect. If stories like this fascinate you, the ones history tried to bury, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Most of our viewers aren't subscribed yet, and content like this takes months to research. 1 click helps us keep telling these stories. Now, let me take you back to Tampa, Florida, Ybor City, Tampa, in the 1920s and 30s, the cigar capital of the world. Picture rows of brick factories where Cuban, Italian, and Spanish immigrants rolled cigars by hand, thousands of them every single day, while a lector stood on a raised wooden platform and read newspapers and novels aloud to the workers. The air was thick with the smell of raw tobacco. The streets outside were lined with mutual aid societies, social clubs, and cantinas where men played dominoes and argued about politics in 3 languages. It looked like a community. Underneath, it was a war zone. Tampa had more mafia-related murders per capita than Chicago during Prohibition. The cigar capital of the world was deadlier per person than Al Capone's city. But the killing was not about bootlegging. Tampa's mob ran Bolita, a Cuban numbers game played with 100 numbered balls drawn from a velvet bag, one winning number a day, millions of dollars wagered every year across the immigrant quarter. Controlling Bolita meant controlling Ybor City, and controlling Ybor City meant controlling Tampa. The man who won that war, who outlasted and outmaneuvered every rival, was Santo Trafficante Jr. He ran the Tampa Mafia from the 1930s onward, not through the flamboyant violence of the New York bosses, but through patience, quiet arrangements, and a preference for deals over bullets. His son, Santo Jr., was born on November 15, 1914, into this world, not as an outsider pulled into crime, but as an heir to it. He grew up watching his father manage a criminal empire the way other men managed a family business, methodically, carefully, with an eye toward the long game. The son learned every lesson. By the time Santo Jr. reached adulthood, he was, by every surface measure, utterly unremarkable. FBI agents who surveilled him over the decades described him as soft-spoken, bespectacled, grandfatherly. He wore conservative suits. He avoided flashy restaurants and nightclubs. One federal agent later said he looked like a retired accountant. He lived in a modest ranch house in North Tampa with his wife Josephine and 2 daughters. Nothing about Santo Trafficante Jr. screamed mafia boss. That was precisely the point. The FBI, meanwhile, was not even looking. For decades, Director J. Edgar Hoover publicly denied the mafia existed. The Bureau had no organized crime division to speak of. Its resources were poured into chasing communists, real and imagined. The most dangerous criminal network in American history operated in broad daylight, and the nation's top law enforcement agency had chosen to pretend it wasn't there. Into that vacuum stepped men like Trafficante, and they filled it completely. In August 1954, Santo Trafficante Sr. died. The transition of power was seamless because Santo Jr. had been running things for years already. His father's declining health through the late 1940s had given the son a long apprenticeship. By the time the old man passed, every important contact, every arrangement, every line of revenue was already in Junior's hands. But Junior did not want to just run Tampa. Tampa was a mid-tier city. The real money, the transformative generational kind, was 90 miles off the coast of Florida, Havana, Cuba, in the 1950s. A tropical city blazing with neon, packed with American tourists, showgirls, jazz musicians, and men in white linen suits who carried more cash than most Americans earned in a year. The casinos, the San Soci, the Tropicana, the Hotel Capri, the Comodoro, the Deauville, operated with the personal blessing of President Fulgencio Batista, a military strongman who understood that power required funding and did not care where it came from. Batista received an estimated $1.28 million per year in direct kickbacks from the mob, a sitting head of state on the mafia's payroll. Havana was Las Vegas before Las Vegas, and Trafficante was its invisible king. He held interests in nearly every major casino on the island. His estimated annual take from Havana gambling operations alone approached figures that modern analysts put at roughly $100 million per year, more money flowing through those casinos every year than the GDP of some Caribbean nations. But his name appeared on almost nothing. That was the Trafficante method, the Bolita empire his father perfected, now scaled to an international level. Frontmen held the titles, straw owners signed the papers, and Santo collected from behind the curtain. He was not the face, he was the hand. And he had an advantage no other American mob boss possessed. Santo Trafficante Jr. spoke fluent Spanish and fluent Italian. In a world where deals were sealed over rum and cigars in Havana nightclubs, where connections to Corsican heroin refiners in Marseille required Italian or French, where Latin American politicians expected to negotiate in their own language, Trafficante moved without friction. He was the bridge between worlds that no one else could connect. Now stop for a second and consider the position this man has built. He is not yet 45 years old. He controls the most lucrative gambling operation in the Western Hemisphere. He has the personal protection of a sitting head of state. He speaks the languages of every criminal network that matters. The FBI doesn't believe his organization exists. And he looks like someone's grandfather. This is the most dangerous kind of power, the kind nobody sees. Trafficante was arrested multiple times over the decades. The charges ranged from bribery to racketeering. Not once was he convicted of a major felony. 30 years, dozens of arrests, multiple grand juries, 0 convictions. Cases fell apart. Witnesses recanted. Evidence disappeared. Grand juries failed to indict. It happened so consistently that it stopped looking like luck and started looking like architecture, a system built specifically to ensure that nothing could ever touch him. On November 14, 1957, state police in upstate New York stumbled onto the largest known gathering of mafia bosses in American history, over 60 of them, at the estate of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York. The raid made national headlines. It shattered Hoover's fiction that the mafia did not exist. Bosses were arrested, photographed, humiliated. But Santo Trafficante Jr., he was either not there or he slipped away before the police closed in. The record is unclear. What is clear is that his name appeared on no arrest report. The pattern held. The decision that defined Trafficante's career was not one dramatic moment, but a pattern, a series of choices to remain invisible. But the clearest single illustration came in Havana. By 1958, it was becoming obvious that Batista's regime was crumbling. Castro's guerrillas were winning in the mountains. Other American mobsters, Meyer Lansky chief among them, began making contingency plans to pull their money out. Trafficante did something different. He stayed. He kept his operations running. He maintained his contacts not just with Batista's people, but according to some accounts, began quietly cultivating relationships with figures connected to the revolutionary movement. He was hedging, playing both sides, not out of ideology, but out of the cold recognition that regimes change, but a man who is useful to everyone survives every regime. Whether Trafficante actually established direct contact with Castro's people before the revolution is debated by historians. What is not debated is the result. When Castro took power on January 1, 1959, and the other American mobsters fled or were arrested and deported, Trafficante was detained, but not deported. He was held at the Trescornia immigration camp for months, and then, inexplicably, released. He walked out of revolutionary Cuba alive and free. No other American mafia boss can say that. Whether this was luck, planning, or something far more calculated, historians have argued for decades. The emotional truth is unmistakable. Trafficante had made himself useful enough or dangerous enough that even Fidel Castro let him go. But Trafficante's release from Cuba was not the end of his entanglement with the island. It was the beginning of something far stranger, because within months, the Central Intelligence Agency came knocking, January 1, 1959. Batista flees in the night. Castro's rebels pour into Havana. Within days, the casinos are raided, shut down their roulette wheels and card tables smashed or seized. The neon goes dark. The dream is over. For most American mobsters on the island, what followed was a frantic scramble. Grab what cash you can, bribe who you can, get on a plane. Meyer Lansky lost an estimated $17 million overnight. $17 million gone in a single night. He never set foot in Cuba again. Trafficante did not run. He was picked up by Castro's security forces and transferred to the Trescornia immigration detention camp, a holding facility outside Havana where the new regime processed foreign nationals. Conditions were Spartan but not brutal. Tropical heat, bare rooms, long days with nothing to do but wait. He was questioned. He waited some more. And here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. While Trafficante sat in Trescornia, he received a visitor, a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. This claim, first made by a British journalist named John Wilson Hudson, who was also detained at Trescornia, and later investigated by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, places Ruby and Trafficante in the same room. 4 years before President Kennedy was shot in Dallas, and 2 days before Ruby himself killed Lee Harvey Oswald on live television. Whether the visit was about money, a favor, or something else entirely has never been established, but the connection exists in the record. Remember it. It matters later. After several months, Trafficante was released. The Cuban government provided no public explanation. He returned to Tampa. To any outside observer, it looked like Trafficante had simply survived a bad break. In reality, something far more significant had shifted. Trafficante now had something the United States government desperately wanted: active contacts still inside Cuba. In the fall of 1960, the Central Intelligence Agency made one of the most extraordinary decisions in its history. Faced with the Castro problem, a communist regime 90 miles from American shores that had survived the Bay of Pigs invasion and was aligning with the Soviet Union, the agency decided to outsource assassination to the Mafia. The approach came through Johnny Roselli. Silver-haired, handsome, charming, Roselli was the Chicago outfit's man in Las Vegas and Hollywood, a mobster who could pass for a studio executive. He was contacted by CIA officer Jim O'Connell from the agency's Office of Security. The pitch was simple. The United States government wanted Castro dead. The mob had contacts in Havana. Would they help? Roselli brought in Sam Giancana, boss of the Chicago outfit, a squat, volatile man who bore no resemblance to the suave gangsters of Hollywood, and who was, at that very moment, sharing a mistress with President John F. Kennedy. And Giancana, in turn, brought in the man with the actual Cuban connections: Santo Trafficante Jr. The CIA's Technical Services Division manufactured botulinum toxin pills, small enough to dissolve in a drink, lethal enough to kill within hours. The pills were passed to Trafficante, who was supposed to arrange delivery through his remaining contacts in Havana, ideally to someone with access to Castro's food. According to CIA records later declassified for the Church Committee, the pills were delivered to the island, but Castro never ingested them. The operation failed. Then another attempt. Then another. A CIA Inspector General's report later documented at least 8 separate plots against Castro, several involving Trafficante directly. The most powerful intelligence agency on Earth tried at least 8 times and failed every single one. Think about what this means. The United States government, the same government that built the atomic bomb that would put a man on the moon within the decade, could not kill one man on an island 90 miles away. And the person they entrusted with the task was a Mafia boss who had every reason in the world not to see Castro dead. Because a living Castro meant a continued threat. And a continued threat meant the CIA continued to need Santo Trafficante. The moment Castro died, Trafficante's usefulness evaporated. Ask yourself, did Trafficante ever actually try? This is the shadow that hangs over everything. Some historians and some former intelligence officers believe Trafficante was playing the most dangerous double game imaginable. The theory goes like this. Trafficante fed information about the CIA's plots directly to Castro's intelligence service, the G2. In exchange, Castro's people protected Trafficante's remaining financial interests on the island and guaranteed his personal safety. If true, it means Trafficante simultaneously took the CIA's money, kept their operational secrets, and betrayed those secrets to the very target, all while maintaining his position in the American Mafia. There is circumstantial evidence: the mysterious release from Trescornia, the consistent failure of every single CIA Mafia plot, the fact that Castro's intelligence service seemed at every turn to know what was coming, the fact that Trafficante suffered no consequences from the CIA or the Mafia for these failures. A man as pragmatic as Trafficante does not fail that many times by accident. No definitive proof has ever surfaced, but the suspicion has never gone away. By 1961, Santo Trafficante Jr. was simultaneously a Mafia boss, an alleged CIA asset, a possible double agent, and a man with connections to figures who would soon be linked to the darkest day in American political history. The Kennedy years were about to begin, and for Trafficante, the stakes were about to become existential. Before the assassination, before the Senate hearings, before the conspiracies, understand the business, because in the end, that is what Trafficante cared about most: the money. By the early 1960s, Trafficante had positioned himself as a critical node in the international heroin pipeline. The route was elegant in its simplicity. Turkish farmers grew opium poppies. The raw opium was shipped to Corsican syndicates in Marseille, France, who refined it into high-grade heroin in clandestine laboratories, the operation that would later become famous as the French Connection. The finished product then needed to reach American streets. That required transshipment points, distribution networks, and above all, a man who could connect the European suppliers to the American buyers. Trafficante was that man. His fluency in Italian gave him direct access to Corsican and Sicilian contacts. His decades of operation in Cuba had given him transshipment infrastructure throughout the Caribbean. When Cuba fell to Castro, he simply shifted the routes, through Santo Domingo, through Honduras, through Panama. The heroin flowed north, the money flowed south, and Trafficante's cut was enormous. And here is what makes this man almost impossible to comprehend. At the exact same time he was running one of the largest heroin pipelines in the Western Hemisphere, he was attending Sunday Mass with his wife and daughters in North Tampa. He drove a modest car. He lived in a neighborhood where his neighbors thought he was a businessman, which, in a sense, he was. The distance between the ranch house in Tampa and the heroin laboratories in Marseille was not just geographic, it was psychological. And Trafficante walked between those two worlds without ever losing his footing. Later, in the 1970s and 80s, Trafficante's narcotics connections would extend into what became known as the Pizza Connection, a massive heroin and money laundering network that used pizza parlors across the eastern United States as fronts. The operation eventually generated hundreds of millions of dollars before being dismantled by federal investigators in 1984. Trafficante's direct involvement was suspected, but once again, nothing stuck. January 20, 1961. John F. Kennedy is inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. He appoints his younger brother, Robert, as Attorney General. And Robert Kennedy immediately declares war on organized crime, with a ferocity that the American Mafia has never experienced. This was not just policy, it was personal. Bobby Kennedy went after the big names: Trafficante, Marcello, Giancana, Hoffa, with wiretaps, surveillance, grand jury subpoenas, deportation proceedings, and the kind of relentless prosecutorial pressure that made life genuinely difficult for men who had operated with impunity for decades. Jimmy Hoffa, president of the Teamsters Union, was Bobby Kennedy's primary obsession. Hoffa was a bulldog of a man, a bare-knuckle labor negotiator who had clawed his way up from the loading docks and who controlled the Teamsters pension fund, hundreds of millions of dollars that had been loaned to mob-connected businesses across the country to build casinos, hotels, and real estate developments. Hoffa was the financial bridge between the legitimate economy and the underworld. Bobby Kennedy wanted him destroyed. For Trafficante, the Kennedy Justice Department was an existential threat, not because he feared conviction, he had beaten every charge thrown at him, but because the pressure was disrupting operations. Wiretaps compromised communications. Surveillance made meetings dangerous. The old way of doing business, quietly, invisibly, through the invisible hand behind every front man, was being systematically dismantled. Carlos Marcello, the boss of the New Orleans Mafia, reportedly expressed the fury that all of them felt. Marcello was a short, thick-necked Sicilian immigrant who controlled gambling, labor racketeering, and political corruption across Louisiana and Texas. According to an FBI informant, later corroborated by Marcello associate Edward Becker, Marcello used a Sicilian proverb to describe his thinking about the Kennedys. If you cut off a dog's tail, it only gets mad and keeps biting you. But if you cut off the dog's head, the whole dog dies. The head, in Marcelo's metaphor, was not Bobby Kennedy. It was the president. John. Remove the president, and the Attorney General loses his power, his platform, everything. It was, by every measure, the logic of assassination. Consider the irony. The CIA had recruited these same men, Trafficante Giancana Roselli, to assassinate a foreign leader. The agency had taught them, in effect, that political assassination was an acceptable tool of statecraft. It had shown them the methods, given them the pills, provided operational cover. And now these same men, under attack from the president's own brother, were contemplating the same solution, but aimed in the opposite direction. Dallas, Texas, November 22, 1963. President Kennedy is shot and killed in Dealey Plaza. Lee Harvey Oswald is arrested. 2 days later, Jack Ruby, the same Ruby who allegedly visited Trafficante in a Cuban detention camp 4 years earlier, walks into the basement of the Dallas Police Department and shoots Oswald dead on live national television. The only man who could testify about the assassination is silenced before he ever sees a courtroom. The Warren Commission, established to investigate the assassination, concluded in 1964 that Oswald acted alone. But the questions never stopped. Before Dallas, a wealthy Cuban exile in Miami named Jose Aleman Jr. told FBI informants about a conversation he had with Trafficante in September 1962. According to Aleman, Trafficante told him that President Kennedy was going to be hit. Aleman understood this as a threat of assassination. When the House Select Committee on Assassinations later questioned Aleman, he recanted, claiming Trafficante had meant Kennedy would be hit at the ballot box politically in the next election. Aleman appeared terrified during his testimony. He died of a heart attack in 1983 at the age of 50, and his family later said he had lived in fear for the last 20 years of his life. Frank Regano, Trafficante's lawyer, the same man who would hear those words whispered in a hospital bed decades later, claimed that in the early months of 1963, Jimmy Hoffa had asked him to deliver a message to Trafficante and Marcelo. The message, according to Regano's memoir, "Something has to be done. The man has to go." Regano said he relayed the message over dinner at the Royal Orleans Hotel in New Orleans. Candlelight. The heavy air of a Louisiana evening. Trafficante and Marcelo listened. They exchanged glances. They said nothing. Did that conversation actually happen? Regano's account has been challenged by historians who note that he did not go public with it until 1994, 7 years after Trafficante's death and decades after the events described. But Regano also made a broader point that is harder to dismiss. These men did not need to discuss things explicitly. They had known each other for decades. They operated in a world where things were understood without being said. A nod was a contract. Silence was consent. If Trafficante and Marcelo decided the president had to go, they would not have discussed it over dinner. They would have simply arranged it. Through intermediaries, through cutouts, through layers of deniability so thick that no investigator could ever penetrate them. The connections are real. Ruby knew Trafficante. Oswald had connections to New Orleans, Marcelo's territory. Trafficante had motive, means, and the operational training the CIA itself had provided. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, after years of investigation, concluded in 1979 that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy, and identified both Trafficante and Marcelo as individuals who had the motive, means, and opportunity to participate. But probably is not proof, and no charges were ever filed. After Dallas, Trafficante's world shifted. Bobby Kennedy, shattered by his brother's murder, resigned as Attorney General in 1964. The relentless pressure on organized crime eased almost overnight. Hoffa was convicted and imprisoned, but Trafficante, untouched. The pattern held. Through the late 1960s and 70s, Trafficante continued to expand his narcotics operations, connecting Southeast Asian heroin sources to American distribution networks, and allegedly facilitating the Pizza Connection pipeline. His Tampa operations continued to generate enormous revenue from gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. The bureau that had spent decades pretending he didn't exist was now watching his every move. Thousands of pages of surveillance, and still nothing stuck. Trafficante appeared before federal grand juries and congressional committees multiple times. He invoked the Fifth Amendment. He denied everything. He projected the same soft-spoken, bespectacled calm that he had maintained his entire life. One prosecutor described the experience of questioning Trafficante as trying to grab smoke. He answered every question with enough words to seem cooperative and enough vagueness to reveal nothing. In any other life, the connections alone would have been enough to destroy a man. The CIA plots, the Kennedy questions, the heroin pipelines, the decades of racketeering. But Trafficante had built his career on a single principle: never be the name on the document, never be the face in the photograph, never be the voice on the recording. Let other men take the titles, the credit, and the risk. The invisible man cannot be prosecuted because, in the eyes of the law, he was never there. The 1970s brought a new threat, not prosecution, but exposure. The Church Committee, chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, began investigating intelligence abuses in 1975. The CIA Mafia assassination plots against Castro were dragged into the light. Trafficante's name was in the files. So was Roselli's. So was Giancana's. The American public learned for the first time that their government had partnered with the Mafia to commit murder. And then the witnesses began to die. One by one, the men who knew the full truth about the CIA plots, about the Kennedy connections, about the web of conspiracy that linked the mob to the American intelligence establishment, started disappearing. And Trafficante watched them all go. On June 1975, Sam Giancana was in his basement kitchen in Oak Park, Illinois, frying sausages and peppers. He was 67 years old. Someone came up behind him, someone he trusted enough to turn his back on, and put a bullet in the back of his head. Then, as Giancana lay on the floor, the killer stood over him and fired 6 more times, each shot placed in a tight circle around his mouth and jaw. The message was not subtle. This is what happens to men who talk. Giancana had been scheduled to testify before the Church Committee in 1 week. 13 months later, in August 1976, a 55-gallon oil drum was found floating in Dumbfounding Bay, Miami. Inside was the body of Johnny Roselli, the silver-haired charmer, Roselli, the man who introduced the CIA to the mob. He had been strangled. His legs had been removed so the body would fit inside the drum. The drum had been weighted with chains, but gases from decomposition had caused it to rise to the surface. Roselli had been called back before the Church Committee for further testimony. He never made it. 2 men, both recruited by the CIA to kill Castro, both linked to the JFK assassination investigation, both scheduled to testify before Congress, both murdered before they could. And the one man who connected them both, the man the CIA had chosen precisely because he had the contacts in Cuba, the man whose name ran through every conspiracy like a thread through a needle, Santo Trafficante Jr. was alive, free and untouched. Coincidence is a generous word for this. Jimmy Hoffa disappeared on July 30th, 1975, less than 6 weeks after Giancana was killed, from the parking lot of a restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan. He has never been found. His body has never been recovered. His presumed murder has been linked to multiple organized crime figures, including Trafficante associate Russell Bufalino. Hoffa, who vanished and was never found, had also been talking about what he knew. In 1978, Santo Trafficante Jr. was compelled to testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He appeared in a Washington hearing room, the same quiet, bespectacled man now in his early 60s, and denied everything. He invoked the Fifth Amendment on critical questions. He acknowledged knowing Roselli. He denied involvement in the Kennedy assassination. He denied that he had ever told Jose Aleman that Kennedy was going to be hit. Committee counsel pressed him on the CIA plots. Trafficante acknowledged participating, but characterized his role as minimal, claiming he was asked to help his country, and did so out of patriotism. The committee was unconvinced. Its final report stated that Trafficante's testimony was evasive and lacking in credibility. The committee concluded that the most likely family bosses of organized crime to have participated in such a unilateral assassination plan against Kennedy were Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante Jr. That finding, the congressional finding that has never been overturned, remains part of the official record of the United States Congress. Was Trafficante actually involved in the assassination of President Kennedy? The honest answer is this: we do not know for certain, and we probably never will. The physical evidence, the testimony of José Alemán, the Ruby connection, the Regano deathbed account, the committee's conclusion is compelling but circumstantial. No murder weapon was ever traced to Trafficante. No direct order was ever recorded, but in the world Trafficante inhabited, direct orders were never given. They were understood, and the circumstantial web around him is denser than around any other single figure in the entire assassination record. As for the double agent question, whether Trafficante was secretly feeding CIA secrets to Castro, the answer remains maddeningly ambiguous. If he was, it would explain the consistent failure of every assassination plot, his inexplicable release from Trescornia, and the fact that Castro's intelligence service seemed perpetually one step ahead. If he was not, then the failures were simply the incompetence of an intelligence agency trying to do something it had no business doing, through men it had no business trusting. Either explanation is damning. Both may be partially true. Giancana, murdered in his own kitchen. Roselli, whose body floated up in a barrel. Hoffa, vanished without a trace. Marcello, eventually convicted of racketeering in 1981, spent years in prison, suffered dementia, died in 1993 in a wheelchair, a broken man. And Trafficante, Santo Trafficante Jr. walked out of every investigation, every hearing, every grand jury room the same way he walked into them, calmly, quietly, free. He died on March 17, 1987, in a Houston hospital. Heart surgery complications. He was 72 years old. 72 years old, natural causes. A hospital bed. In the American Mafia, that is the rarest ending of all. He died with his family around him, or, if you believe Frank Regano, with his lawyer at his bedside whispering those words that would echo for decades. The dying man's confession, or the ramblings of a fading mind, depending on whom you ask. Consider the fates of his contemporaries. Sam Giancana, 7 bullets in his own kitchen. Johnny Roselli, cut apart and sealed in a drum in the ocean. Jimmy Hoffa, gone from a parking lot, never seen again. Carlos Marcello, convicted, imprisoned, diminished. Lucky Luciano, exiled to Italy, collapsed at a Naples airport. Albert Anastasia, cornered in a barber's chair and never stood up. Paul Castellano, cut down in front of a steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan. The American Mafia of the 20th century was a profession with a very specific retirement plan. Trafficante avoided every version of it. Here is something that should reframe everything you have just heard. For decades, the story of organized crime in America has been told as a New York story. The 5 families, The Godfather, Mulberry Street. But the Tampa Mafia, the Trafficante family's organization, is the longest continuously operating mafia family in the United States. Not New York, not Chicago. Tampa. And for most of its history it operated so far beneath the media's attention that its existence was barely acknowledged by the national press. The mafia story we tell ourselves is a New York myth. The reality was always more sprawling, more southern and more invisible than the movies suggest. The committee's finding that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy involving organized crime figures remains the official conclusion of the United States Congress. It has never been overturned, superseded, or officially challenged. It sits in the public record, a conclusion without a conviction, a verdict without a sentence. In a Houston hospital room in March 1987, a man who looked like a retired accountant whispered something to his lawyer in Sicilian dialect. Whether those words were a confession, a regret, or simply the wanderings of a dying mind, no one will ever know for certain. What we know is this: Santo Trafficante Jr. ran an empire that spanned continents. He partnered with the CIA and possibly betrayed them. He was named as a probable conspirator in the murder of a president. He oversaw a heroin network that destroyed thousands of lives, and he was never convicted of anything. He died in bed. Some men are remembered because they were caught. Santo Trafficante Jr. is remembered by the few who know his name, because he never was. If this story changed the way you think about organized crime in America, subscribe and share this video. The stories history buries are the ones that matter most.